There's been a very interesting concept or subject that has come across my desk most recently, and it is the perhaps the difference between Jesus, Yeshua Hamashiach, Jesus the Messiah, and Paul of Tarsus. Now, I read a sort of article written by someone explaining how Jesus and Paul's teachings are definitely different. However, they're not contradictory, because there is a narrative device given in Acts of the Apostles that links them together. Here's the interesting thing about Paul. He's got a different gospel than Jesus. He simply does, and later on there's something written. I'm not sure if it's Paul or pseudo Paul, and by pseudo Paul I mean those epistles that were not really written by Paul, but they got Paul's name put on it, which was a common practice at the time, I guess. And half of the, or nearly half of the epistles supposedly written by Paul in the Bible were not written by him anyway. So the reason I bring that up is because in one of the epistles I remember reading, if others will come with different gospels. I think Paul says that. I could be wrong. However, from the beginning, Paul had a different gospel, acknowledged in those who were Jesus' disciples, who actually knew him and hung out with him in real life, didn't know about this new gospel that Paul had, which was supposedly revealed to Paul by an ascended Jesus Christ. So, for very many years, I've personally taken the route suggested by a biblical scholar named Scott Nelson, who suggested that Paul was, I suppose, not to be trusted. Paul was either a false prophet or a false teacher, or simply a false apostle, not a true follower. He may have had some real respect for the historical person of Jesus. However, as Scott Nelson reports, he shows evidence in the words of Jesus in the Gospels that Peter is warned by Jesus about Paul, someone that will come and tie his hands after Jesus is gone. Supposedly, in this interpretation of Scripture, Nelson suggests that Jesus knew that Paul was coming to usurp the faith, ultimately, to usurp the teachings away from Jesus' disciples. So in this view, which I've had to an extent, because it's been a very interesting argument, and also I used this argument as a springboard for really studying the Gospels and the words of Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach. That's what I focused on for a very long time in my biblical scholarship. Apart from what I saw to be a trend in churches, which is pretty much reading the Gospel of John, which is quite different from the other Gospels, which you might know, and the epistle of Paul to the Romans. So John and Romans. There's a great deal of Baptist churches, non-denominational churches. I swear they present the entire religion, at least the beginnings of it. They put all of the doctrine and dogma into Paul's letter to the Romans, and also the Gospel of John. It's a highly theosophical work. Less, I don't want to say less historic, but there's something just a little bit, theological, Christological about it, and it's slightly divorced from a plain perspective of Jesus' life and teachings. So for a long time, I focused on Jesus' life and teachings, whereas the death and resurrection was sort of put out for a time, or put aside for a time. And back to the article that I first referenced at the beginning of all this, it says, there are two gospels which Paul, which Peter and the other disciples didn't know about. Paul supposedly comes with this new one during the Acts of the Apostles, and ends up sort of winning the game of which gospel will be enacted in the future, at least for Paul's sake, because he's the apostle to the Gentiles, whereas the rest of them talking to Jews. And this article says something like Jesus only spoke to two Gentiles in his entire ministry. Everyone else was a Jew. But of course I'm stalling for time because I'm just trying to think about what's really going on here. Really, okay, this is what I meant to bring up. Two gospels. The first one is Jesus' gospel, which has to do with the identity of Christ. The second gospel is Paul's gospel, that has to do with the work of Christ. Now, this is a very serious subject, as I am admittedly, I suppose, weak on the Christological study of Paul and Paul's writings, specifically in Romans, as I've been cued to by a friend. And, it's certainly the stuff I read as a young child growing up. I remember reading the book of Romans one time in a study hall at Thomas More High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and tearing up over it. There's just something about, he that worketh not, his faith is counted as righteousness unto him. Which made me feel good, because there was a release from having to do good and good things. It was simply the salvation that came from believing, and that was it. So yeah, and this is something I'll be looking into. But at the beginning, two gospels: Jesus' gospel, which is the identity of Christ, which I feel like charging the modern church with having no idea really about that, because it really is quite phenomenal if you find out about the identity of Christ. Then you have the work of Christ spoken about by Paul. Now I'm going to go into what this might mean for personality typing, socionics, and cognitive functions. I really think that it's quite possibly the same gospel spoken in two different ways. This is my hypothesis at this point. It's just sort of what I feel. I have a little hunch that this might be the thing, and I also look for isomorphisms everywhere. TI versus TE. There's a certain TI understanding. Alpha and beta quadrants of personality types use this function. Well, everyone uses the function, but they it's called a valued function. It's in the top 4 in the stack. There's something about the identity of Christ that has to do with it's still talking about the law. If you forgive someone else, your Father in heaven will forgive you. Whereas that's Jesus' teaching, by the way. But then Paul's teaching is saying that the Lord has already forgiven you. God has already forgiven you because of Christ's shed blood. Christ was the living sacrifice, so that already happened. And therefore you're already forgiven as long as you have faith. So as a gratefulness for that, forgive others. So it's seemingly not the same thing. One has to do with a sort of universal law. To me, that's a TI thing. It's the wires underneath. If you do this, then that will happen. It's sort of a TI principle. But the TI is different. Really, I think it might be the same phenomenon talked about in two different ways, depending on the sort of logic that individuals have. So for me, I can see maybe one explanation being treacherous to the other type, or at least hard to understand, and vice versa. If a TE person reads the TI thing, they might interpret the TI as TE. That might be problematic. And also the other way around. A TI person might read the TE as TI. it could be very problematic, I guess. So it's like, I guess, for building churches, which is what most people are doing. If you find churches, many of them will preach what Paul was saying in Romans, and also Romans and John has to do with Christ's death and resurrection. However, the details of Christ's life, identity, and biography can be, in my perspective, entirely missed. And maybe it's not important. I would say in some sense it's not important, because there are many people who can read Paul's letters and the Gospel of John, and it enhances their life. It makes them feel forgiven, and therefore gives them a permission slip to live a better life, a happier, more fulfilled life, and also have better relations with other people. Maybe TE is better for that. And it reminds me of Delta Quadra, and there's something about the Delta Quadra personalities. They don't have a TI framework that can view universals between systems as Alpha and Beta Quadra are more able to do. They simply have more commonly have one way of doing things within one kind of system. They're much closer to the ground in that sense. They're less abstract. They are the final stage of breath. And they are the builders down in Malchus, or the world of Asya, if you're viewing this Kabbalistically, where there are 4 worlds equated to the 4 quadras of personalities. Some have called Paul an ESTJ, which is an LSE within socionics, which is down in the Delta Quadra, extroverted thinking. TE is going on down there, so there are very simple rules: do this, do that. But for the TI user, this might be, we ask the question, why? Why though? I'm not simply going to do that just because it is brought down and it's a task. It's something that you can put into your backlog, and I guess we'll be doing it. After a while, I think the TI user needs a better understanding, some kind of TI understanding, and perhaps the identity, the actual laws of the universe, because the laws of the universe are not the laws of a specific religious group that says do this, do that. It's not what it is, but we're looking for the spirit of the law, and the rules of thumb, at least, that guide the entire universe, no matter the system. Identity, work. Identity, work. Identity, work.